Good day, this is Bennett, also known as Jeremiah. Today we're going to talk about counting principles. This is the fifth video of the playlist. I've designed the playlist in such a way that by the time you're done with this playlist, you will be good in counting principles, which is also known as probability grade 12. If you're interested in the playlist is found at the end of this video. It is also found right here on the top right of the screen at the suggested video. So, let's begin. Alright. Let's say you are choosing numbers from 1 until 8, right? So we're choosing any number from 1 to 8 and we want to create a 4-digit code. Now let's say they ask you how many codes can be created if the code that is formed must be greater than 5,000, right? So number one, for the code to be greater than 5,000, what matters is the beginning, right? What matters is the beginning. So for it to be greater than 5,000, notice that it can start with a 5, right? Yes, it can start with a 5 because the minute it ends with 1, it's immediately bigger than 5,000 and there are no zeros here, right? So it is allowed to start with a 5, right? So what you fill in these dashes are strictly the number of choices. For instance, in the first digits, how many can you choose from? So for it to be greater than 5,000, it can start with a 5. Remember, we're choosing numbers from 1 to 8, but it must be 5 upwards because we want it to be greater than 5. So it can start with a 5, it can start with a 6, it can start with a 7, it can start with an 8. So therefore, we have got 4 choices. So you strictly write down the number of choices that you have in each dash. So notice that in the first dash, we can choose from any 4 of these numbers, right? And let's say they are not allowed to be repeated. So before we had 4 choices and one of the 4 choices would have been used, right? So in the next dash, we're not restricted now. We are allowed to choose any number, right? Because what matters is the beginning. So we're allowed to choose any number from 1 to 8. But we're not going to have 8 choices because one of the numbers would have already been used here and we're not allowed to repeat. That's why, right? So one of the numbers would have already been used here. So because of that, we'll not be left with 8 choices. So we'll be left with 7 choices. And then here, because one of the 7 choices has been used here, we can't use it again. So basically, we'll be left with 6 choices. And then, since one of them is used, here we'll be left with 5 choices. So then you put multiplication signs in between. So this is what we have. So then 4 times 7, which is 28, and then we have to multiply by 6 and then times 5. So you type this in a calculator and you get your answer. So what about if they say that how many 3-digit codes can be formed if the number must be less than 400, right? So how many 3-digit codes can be formed? So now notice for it to be less than 400, it depends on the first one again, right? So now for it to be less than 400, it has to be, the first digit must definitely be lower than 4. So from 1, we're actually going to have 1, 2, and 3, right? So if we have to start from 1. So these are the numbers in this option that are less than 4. So how many choices do we have in the first one? We've got 3 choices. So now let's say they are not allowed to be repeated. So if they're not allowed to be repeated, notice that here we're supposed to be able to choose any one of the 8 choices, but one of them would have already been used here. So due to that, we're going to have 7, and then here we're going to have 6, since one of them would have been used in the 7 choices that we have. Right? We've got 7 choices, one of them will be used. So therefore, after here will no more be left with 7 choices, since one has already been used, we'll now be left with 6 choices. But if they say they're allowed to be repeated, it means that here, even though we used one of the numbers, we can still use it again, so we still have the full 8 choices, right? And then here, even though we used one of the 8 choices again, we still can repeat it again, right? So we're still going to have 8 choices again. So it would have been multiplication, multiplication, right? So that's how it is. But now, since they're not allowed to be repeated, then we're just going to have 7 choices and then 6, and then we put multiplication, multiplication. So we just type this in the calculator and we get our answer. Make sure you don't leave it like this. This is just the first step in the exam. Make sure you get your answer. Now let's take it further. What about if they say how many 4-digit codes can be created if the code that is formed must be even. Notice, if you look at this number, maybe look at this number, let's just say we look at this number. Is this number even or odd? Right? Is this number even or odd? The whole number is even. Why? Because it ends with an even number. It's divisible by 2. Even though all these numbers are odd, as long as it ends with an even number, the whole number becomes even. So for a number to be even, it has to end with an even number. So now if they ask you how many digits can be formed if the code must be even, what matters this time is the last, right? So it means that we have to focus on the restrictions still. We always start with the restrictions before we fill in the other places. So now, for the whole code to be even, we have to end with an even number. So how many even numbers do we have here? So here we've got 2, 4, 6, and 8. So we've got 4 choices that we can choose. So basically, in the last digit, we can choose any one of the 4 choices. So once the restriction is filled, now you can focus on the others. So we're supposed to have any one of the 8 choices. Let's just say they're not allowed to be repeated. So we're supposed to have any one of the 8, but because one of them would have already been used here, then we're going to have 7 choices. And then since one is used here, we're going to have 6. And then since one is used here, we're going to have 5. And then that's what we have, right? So 7 times 6 times 5 times 4. So let's just say they ask you how many codes can be created, how many 3-digit codes can be formed if the digit must be odd. Well, for it to be odd, it has to end with an odd number, right? So odd numbers here is just 1, 3, 5, and 7. 4 choices again. So we're just going to have 4 choices here. And then here in the first one, so we're done with the restriction, now we can focus on the rest. So in the first one, we're supposed to be able to choose any one of the 8, but since one of them has already been used, we only have 7 to choose from. And then since one of them is going to be used here, we're going to have 6. So basically we have 7 times 6 times 4. And then we type in the calculator, we get our answer.
Just before I continue, if you want to be tutored, whether it is online or physically, whether it is the situation where you're struggling in maths or whether it is the situation where you're good in maths but want perfection, take a screenshot or save these details. Whether you're studying Cambridge, which is the UK curriculum, or whether you're studying NSC, which is the South African curriculum, or IEB, or native courses which start from N1 to N6, or any curriculum you're doing no matter which country you're at, we offer tutorials. We've got lessons and practice sessions 5 days a week. We also give you tests once a week so that we can check your improvement.
Alright, here is another scenario. So let's say we are choosing numbers from 1 to 7. And then they ask you how many 4-digit codes can be created if the code that is formed must be greater than 5,000 and it must be even. So for it to be greater than 5,000, it depends on the first digit. For it to be even, it depends on the last digit. So let's focus on each, and let's just say they say the numbers are allowed to be repeated. So for it to be greater than 5,000, it has to start from 5 going upwards, right? Because even if it's 5001, it's bigger than 5,000. So we do not have a 0 here, so we don't have to worry about it. So it can start from 5 or 6 or 7, right? So we can choose 5, we can choose 6, we can choose 7, because we're choosing numbers from 1 to 7, but it must be bigger than 5,000. So therefore we can choose either 5 or 6 or 7. So we have got 3 choices here. So now at the end, it must be even, right? So for the whole code to be even, it must end with an even number. So how many even numbers do we have here? So now notice that the even numbers from 1 to 7 are 2, and then 4, and then 6, right? So we've got 3 digits that we can choose from. So we have got 3 choices here, so we're done with the restrictions. So if we choose any one of the 3 choices, then it's going to be even. So now we have to focus on the other part, right? So now here, how many choices do we have? They said they're allowed to be repeated. So therefore, we can choose any one of the 7 again. And then here we still can choose any one of the 7. So this is what we have eventually. So now, what about if they say we've got the same number we can choose from 1 to 7, but now they say that how many digits can be formed if the code that is formed must be, so how many 4-digit codes can be formed if the code that is formed must be less than 4,000 and must be divisible by 5. So just before we continue, if you are interested in knowing the prices of the tutorials. The video that contains the prices and the updated contact details, just in case these ones have changed, is found at the end of this video. So they ask you how many codes can be formed if the code that is formed must be less than 4,000 and must be divisible by 5. So for something to be divisible by 5, it has to end with a 5 or a 0, right? Notice the multiples of 5, 5, 10, 15, okay, so 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So now notice that it becomes, here it's like 0, 5, 5 is the same as 0, 5. Notice the last digit, it's 5, 0, 5, 0, 5. So it will continue becoming 5, 0, 5, 0 until it gets bigger. So any number basically that ends with a 5 or a 0 is divisible by 5, right? So this is divisible by 5, right? So for it to be divisible by 5, it has to end with a 5 or a 0. So let's start with the beginning. For it to be less than 4,000, the first digit matters. So it must not start with a 4. It must start with less than 4. So how many options do we have? We can start with 1 or 2 or 3. So basically we've got 3 choices in the first one. Let's say they say the numbers are not allowed to be repeated. So it can start with, so we have 3 choices that it can start with, right? And then at the end, for it to be divisible by 5, it must end with a 5 or a 0. So here we only have 5. From 1 to 7 we only have 5. There is no 0. So basically we only have one choice. We can only choose one, right? We can only choose the 5. So we've got one choice. So now, since the numbers are not allowed to be repeated, we had 7 numbers before, but 1 has been used here, 1 has been used here, right? Here we've got 3 choices, but not all 3 will be used. Only 1 will be used. So 1 has been used here, 1 has been used here. So therefore here we're going to be left with 5 to choose from. And then since 1 is used here, here we're going to be left with 4 to choose from. So this is what we have. So now we're going to have 3 times 5 times 4, which is eventually 60. So that's what we have.
Alright, we have reached the end of this video. I have included a playlist of similar type of questions. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Any questions you've got or any video you want me to create, please comment below. See you in the next video.